Hello everyone, welcome to IMPRINT IS. I'm Varun Khulla, and today we're going to look into the chapter 12, that is the foreign policy in the Nehru era, right? And we look at the formation of Indian foreign policy. Remember, Jawaharlal Nehru was himself the leader, and used to actually take care of the foreign policy himself, right? Okay, so let's start. So, foreign policy, chapter number 12, the Nehru era, right? And this is from the book India After Independence, 1947 to 2000 by Mridula Mukherjee, Aditya Mukherjee, and Bipin Chandra. Right. So the basic parameters. Let's start with the first topic. So India's effort to pursue independent foreign policy was a highlight of the post 1947 politics. It was a product of its long history, recent past, and this policy was marked with a great deal of consistency and continuity. There was this, despite there was revolutionary changes in the international situations, right? Think about the fact that the Cold War started. The people who were allies in the World War II became staunch enemies. The broad parameters which were evolved during the freedom struggle and in the early years of independence still retain their validity, though obviously things have changed since the disintegration of the Soviet Union, right? Jawaharlal Nehru stands as the architect of this, and this is not a mean achievement, right? He said that, very interestingly, he said, given her great civilization, India could not but aspire to speak in her own voice. And basically, Nehru thought that the hard-won freedom from colonial yoke would be meaningless unless it found expression in the international era. So, an independent voice was not merely a choice; it was an imperative in that era. It was Nehru who, gave his voice a shape in the form of the idea of non-alignment and an organizational cohesion through the non-aligned movement. The immediate context for the emergence of the movement was a division onto two blocks. We talked about the fact that one block was the US bloc and the Western powers and NATO. The other was the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union. So Nehru's understanding was, newly independent poor countries of Asia and Africa had nothing to gain and everything to lose by falling for the temptation of joining the military blocs of the big powers, because they would just be used as pawns, right? And the actual need were to fight poverty, illiteracy, disease, and these could not be met by joining blocs, right? Their interest basically laid in the area of peace, not of war or hostility. India therefore neither joined or approved the Baghdad Pact, the Manila Treaty, the Seattle, the CENTO, which joined the countries of the West and the East Asia to the Western power bloc. Nehru was quick to change, reject the charge of immoral neutrality, which was hurled at India by John Foster Dulles. For him, non-alignment meant having the freedom to decide each issue on its merit and to weigh whether it was right or wrong, and then take a favor instead. And to quote him, he says, so far as all these evil forces of fascism, colonialism, radicalism, or the nuclear bomb and the aggression and separation are concerned, we shall stand most emphatically and unequivocally committed against him. We are non-aligned only to the relation to the Cold War and its military pacts. We object to all this business of forcing the new nations of Asia and Africa into the Cold War machine. Otherwise, we are free to condemn any development which we consider wrong or harmful to the world or ourselves, and we want to use that freedom every time the occasion arises. So non-alignment basically came to symbolize the struggle of India and other newly independent nations to retain and strengthen their independence from colonial and imperialism. And India became the first, independent nation to give the lead to ex-colonies in this respect, right? The idea is that this increase in the membership of the UN, which happened after the independence of so many countries, served as check to the domination by the Western Bloc. So what happened? Non-alignment, does actually advance the process of democratization. Otherwise, what would have happened is that it would have been Soviet Union against the Americans, and that what would have happened is that you would have to choose one side and then give up your freedom into international affairs accordingly. Now, a basic objective of Indian foreign policy, that of extending support to colonial and ex-colonial countries in their struggle against colonialism, was well served by the policy of non-alignment. Right. Remember, Nehru was basically passionate in his opposition to war and to the threat of nuclear conflict. And obviously, remember the fact that he was a non-violent, active participant of the non-violent struggle, and his conviction in Gandhi also resolved him to, actually make his mission to fight and outlaw the atomic bomb. He was, supported by great intellectuals like Einstein and Bernard Russell. And Nehru made it clear that India's role, right, is to place the goal of nuclear disarmament and general disarmament before the world. And the idea was that at the same time when Nehru was pointing out the dangers of world war, extension to nuclear conflict, right? Chairman Mao basically told that a future nuclear war was only a stage in an inevitable march towards socialism. And he said that, if 300 million people died, right, that is 300 million Chinese, another 3 million, 100 million would survive. But obviously, Nehru constantly emphasized that peaceful coexistence of countries with different ideologies, differing systems was a necessity, and believed that nobody had a monopoly on truth and pluralism was a fact of life. Right, and to this he outlined the Panchi, and I think you should note this. These are mutual respect for each other's countries' territorial integrity and sovereignty, non-aggression, non-interference in each other's internal affairs, equality, mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. So these are very, very important. Please note these. Okay. Now, how did Nehru articulate his ideas, right? So what he did was, before independence in March 1947, at his inspiration, an Asian Relations Conference was held, and more than 21 countries came to Delhi, right? And then the tone of the conference was obviously of Asian independence and assertion on the world stage. And obviously, there was another conference. It was called in 1948 because the Dutch wanted to recolonize Indonesia. Nehru invited states, bordering the Indian Ocean and Asian as well Australia came, right? The conference resolved to deny all facilities to Dutch shipping and sends its resolution to the UN. And within a week, the Security Council resolved that the ceasefire must be declared and the Indonesian national government was restored. And then, this decolonization initiative was carried further at the Asian Leaders Conference in Colombo in 1954 and the Afro-Asian Conference called by India and other Colombo powers in Badung in Indonesia in 1955. This was a precursor to the Belgrade non-aligned conference, right? And it passed, resolutions, on world peace and dangers of nuclear weapons. And finally, the pinnacle of Nehru's efforts reached in 1961, where he stood with Nasser's Egypt and Tito's of Yugoslavia to call for nuclear disarmament and peace in Belgrade. What has happened is that Indian foreign policy protected Indian economic interests, and obviously non-alignment, by not tying India to any other bloc, enabled her to develop economic ties with countries on both sides of the divide when she needed. She needed and got capital, machines, technology, food from Western countries. She also relied, especially after 1954, on the Soviet Union for building her public sector industries, something which the US was reluctant to do. Further, the most interesting thing you can see is the military equipment we got, right? So we got 104 Tufani, right, aircrafts from France, 182 Hunters and Canberras from UK, Meisters from France, AN-12 and Mi-4 from Soviet Union, and Fairchild packets from the US. Further, Vampire aircrafts were produced in UK. Right, so Navy also got similar things from various other countries. So that tells you that actually non-alignment helped in the beginning. Right, the variety of sources from which India's defense equipment alone shows that India succeeded in maintaining sufficiently friendly relations with a large number of countries. Right, so that everybody was trying to woo India in those times. But remember, Indian foreign policy sometimes linked apparently irreconcilable goals. For example, the Soviet Union and India initiated in 1963 and assigned in August 1964, right, major arms deals, which Soviet Union became the largest supplier to India, arms supplier that is. And obviously, Indian-Soviet relation became very, very strong. We became pro and pro-Soviet. At the same time, India decided to adopt the Green Revolution technology for agriculture development, which was backed by the US. The arms deals with the Soviet Union and the Green Revolution, which led to India becoming self-sufficient in food, and a few years' time increased India's capacity to stand on our own feet and take a more independent stand in world affairs. Similarly, both US and the Soviet Union at different times agreed to be paid in rupees and thus saving India's precious currency. So again, definitely, Indian foreign policy was very interesting during that times. The profile that Nehru had in the international affairs was extremely large, I would say. Okay, now we'll be looking into the various international roles that India had, right? But I think a question which can be easily framed and answered till now is the fact is discuss the impact of Nehru's in foreign policy in the post-independence period, right? So that would be something that I think everybody should write. Okay, let's start with the Korean War. So this was very interesting because here it was the first test of India. So what happened? In the Korean War, at the end of the World War II, it left Korea divided between a communist North controlled by a socialist camp and a socialist South Korea dominated by Western powers. Now, KPS Menon, who was elected chairman of the United Nations Commission on Korea in 1947, had appealed to the UN to the great powers to let Korea be united. Otherwise Korea may blow up, but it was to no avail. When North Korea was invaded, when North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950, India supported the US in Security Council, condemning North Korea as an aggressor and calling for a ceasefire. But American pleasure soon turned into anger when they found India abstained from voting on another resolution calling for assistance to South Korea and setting up for a unified command for this purpose. India didn't want any entry of outside powers, and it appealed to Truman and Stalin, right? And Stalin actually, responded positively. But what happened was General MacArthur, who was the head of the U.S. forces in the UN command, right, after pushing North Korean forces out of South Korea without the approval of UN, crossed the 38th parallel and continued it into the Yalu River that separated Korea and China. Now, Zhou Enlai, right, who was the Chinese prime minister, warned the Western powers, right, through the Indian ambassador to China, K.M. Parekar, right, but China realized that they would not listen. What happened was China therefore sent waves of armed volunteers and succeeded in pushing back the American troops south of the 38th parallel, which resulted in huge, Chinese, Korean, and American casualties. Right. Nehru again tried that let's try to end the war, basically organizing a conference. But US squared the peach with an ill-timed resolution declaring China the aggressor. And India voted against it, and because it was clearly MacArthur and not China who was aggressive. So think about the fact that India voted for the US, then abstained, and now has voted against the US. Right. So in a couple of years that has happened. A military stalemate ensured that India's tireless efforts took till June 53 to get more, both sides to agree to a ceasefire. And finally, a neutral national nations repatriation commission was set up with an Indian, that is Jalnath Thamaya, as a chairman, and an Indian custodian force under charge were made responsible for the difficult task of repatriation of soldiers. The Korean War has tested India's faith in non-alignment and commitment to peace to the utmost, and she had not been found wanting. Very interestingly, she stoically first faced Chinese and Soviet hostility because she voted to declare North Korea the initial aggressor. Then she endured American wrath from refusing to go along with the Western intervention for declaring China the aggressor. And remember that during this part itself, China had invaded Tibet, who was a protectorate of India, and annexed it without any effort to keep India in the picture. Though it upset Nehru, obviously he did not allow to influence its stand on Korea. Now that was something very interesting. That how India behaved, despite the fact that it would have made sense for them to vote against China. Further, India continued to press the UN to recognize and give a seat to Communist China in the Security Council, especially now that USSR had withdrawn from it in protest. India also badly needed food aid from the US to meet the near famine condition at home, but again did not allow the so blinded stance in Korea. She refused to press ahead even if success was not always apparent. In the end, India's stand was vindicated and both sides agreed to recognize the same boundary they had tried to change. Right, and this was actually the proof, right, that India would be not cowardly, neutral, or an idealist hogwash. Right, but remember, there was another problem, right, that we actually had joined, the membership of the Commonwealth. right? And it was seen that India is coming to Western imperialism. So obviously, USSR again had some issues here, right? Whether which side India is going, and that was actually the biggest and the most interesting thing that was happening in the 1950s. That which side would India go? And both sides, Soviet Union and the US, wanted India to be there on their sides. Okay. Then, very interestingly, we have something else in the Indochina, right? Remember, the Korean War only brought a momentary respite to Asia. In 1954, Indochina appeared to become the next theater of holy crusades against, communism, with the U.S. keen to pour massive aid to shore up the very and hesitant French colonial power, right, which was basically going on in a war with Vietnam. Right. So Nehru's initiative basically was to appeal for a ceasefire and obtaining the support of various leaders at the Colombo Conference in 1954. And Krishna Menon was sent to the Geneva Conference, right, on Indochina, though India was not invited as a member. Nehru's meeting was Zhou Enlai in 1954 Delhi, and behind the scene parleys and assurances prevented further internationalization of the conflict. India obtained guarantees from China for neutralization of, Laos and Cambodia, and promises from Great Britain and France to China that they would not allow US to have bases in Laos and Cambodia. And Pierre Mendes, who's the French Prime Minister, said that this is a 10-power conference in the Geneva Conference, 9 at the table and India. Right, and further reiterate, India-China relationship very close, right? So China actually asked India to be appointed the chairman of the International Control Group, and it work included a supervision of imports of foreign armament into Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Right, so obviously, though if you think about it, this thing didn't really end, right? Because remember, the US actually invaded Vietnam later on as well, right? But still, this basically solved the problem at that time. Okay, right. Let's go for the next topic. That's the Suez Canal, and this has been asked in mains in 2013. There's a question which has been asked, so I think you should go through that question. All right, right. So let's further ado. Let's talk about it. In 1956, in an impulsive reaction to the U.S. and British pressure to abandon its declared policy of non-alignment, the latest movement was the Anglo-American withdrawal of the promised financial aid for building the Aswan Dam on River Nile. And Egypt, basically what it did was it nationalized the Suez Canal, and basically what it did was it alarmed Britain and France, right? And they wanted international control over it. As you can understand, under the Constantinople Convention, Suez Canal was an integral part of Egypt, and India recognized it. She argued both Cairo and London to broad restraint, and tried at the London conference in August to get the agreement on the formula that included Egyptian control and advisory for the users and the settlement of disputes in accordance with the UN Charter. But what happened was France and Britain got Israel to attack Egypt and landed their troops in Suez, and they were even condemned by the US and the UN. Nehru actually called it naked aggression and reversion to colonial methods. What happened was a withdrawal took place under UN supervision, and Indian troops, participated in the peacekeeping forces. And India continued to support Egyptian interests in subsequent negotiation, leading to the settlement, even while trying to ensure that Jain and other users' interests were protected. So obviously, this basically somehow ended, the Britain aggression after the World War, and the hegemony of the Pax Britannica actually kind of ended with this. The next topic was something very interesting, right? And India abstained, from the condemnation of the Soviet Union intrusion into Hungary. And in Hungary, what happened was in October, Soviet Union actually intruded, right? October 1956. And what it did was now Hungary wanted to basically so there were certain people in Hungary who wanted to get out of the Soviet bloc, and this was the intrusion came as to crush this rebellion. But India's stand was that while the Soviets must withdraw, the situation was not as simple as it made out to be, and the existence of two zones of influence, West and East, in Europe was a fact of a post-World War II, and any disturbance could set off a domino effect. Nehru himself criticized the Soviet action and did not send an ambassador to Budapest for 2 years to show his unhappiness. The Soviets reciprocated by abstaining when the Kashmir next came up into Security Council, right? But thereafter, they reverted to the usual practice of vetoing resolutions that were against India's interest. India's situation was not an easy one, but she stood, withstood basically considerable pressure from both sides and did not flip in either direction. But what it did was here, I think India's stance was actually a little more complicated, right? Maybe definitely that India pursued non-alignment, but here the West now started to think that maybe, right, India is not that non-aligned and is tilting towards the Soviet side here. Okay, so the most interesting one was Congo, I would say, right? So the first one, if you think about, if you think about what's happening. So the first, obviously, is the Korean War, and in which all the parties are responsible, right? So China, Russia, and the other side we have the US, right? Indochina, you have the French and the US against China and others, right? In Suez Canal, we have Egypt and against the old Egyptian, hegemonies, that is Britain and France. In France, in Hungary, we had Soviet Union against the West, right? But in Congo, it was very interesting. It was Belgium. So this was seen to be a major achievement of Indian foreign policy, and it was basically very interesting because it helped in maintaining the integrity and independence of Congo. Right. So what has happened is that Congo barely gained her independence from Belgium on 30th of June 1960, when its copper-rich province of Katanga announced its independence from Congo. Its head, the Shombe, was clearly being backed by Belgium, and Belgian troops was also sent to the Congolese capital essentially to protect the citizens. Lumumba, the Prime Minister of Congo, appealed to the UN, US, and USSR for help, and UN asked the Secretary General Daj Hammer, Hammarskjöld, to organize all necessary help. But what happened was all foreign powers propped up their favorite local players in the mad scramble for power, and the US supported the president, Kasavubu, right? The Soviets practiced Lumumba, the Belgians blessed the military leader, Mobutu. And what happened was their tactics eventually led to the murder of the Prime Minister Lumumba, right? And Lumumba murder shocked the world when then Nehru forcefully demanded that the UN play a more decisive role to get rid of the mercenaries and the foreign troops and stop the civil war and convene and form a new government. And India basically said that we were ready to commit troops for the purpose, and the UN agreed. The UN Council adopted a resolution on 21st of February 1961, and Indian armed forces successfully brought the civil war to a close by restoring the central government authority over Katanga and the rest of the world, right? And that Hammarskjöld actually reportedly said that, thank God for India. And the praise was not undeserved, and it was the finest movement of India's policy of non-alignment, and it basically of help to newly independent countries of Africa, Asia, and strengthening the rule of multilateral bodies such as the UN. And Nehru had again shown that given the will, non-alignment could work, and there was no space, right? Not just the space, but the need for non-alignment to assert themselves in the side of the newly emerging countries. So very, very interesting thing, I would say, right? Okay, we'll stop here, and we'll continue with the relationship with the superpowers, that is USA, USSR, Soviet Union, right? And we look at Pakistan and China, so right? So we look at the IR area more in detail, right? And we look at the whose fault was it when India was attacked by China, and basically whether Indian foreign policy has worked or not, right? Okay, right. So that is going to be the conclusion in the next video, right? Thank you so much.